example for the rest of our country. I thank them and I appreciate so much the effort they have made in setting an example for all. I want to thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Oh, they don't have a chair for her. Here. They'll move a chair.
Back to your right.
Later today, the Senate will continue voting on amendments to the post office bill. A final passage vote is also expected today. Congressional Quarterly writes that among the most interesting amendments that still face votes are proposals by Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who we just saw on the Senate floor, and Kentucky Republican Rand Paul. Manchin's amendment, which could be the first proposal considered this afternoon, would extend a moratorium on all post office and processing facility closures for 2 years. One of Paul's several amendments would have direct impact on Capitol Hill operations, requiring the closure of all but one post office in the Capitol complex. Many legislative office buildings currently have their own internal post offices.
Madam President,
Senator from Alaska.
I wish to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
I rise today in support of Senate Bill 1925, the Violence Against Women's Act. It's not every day we get to vote on a law that actually saves lives, but this one does. The Senate needs to send the simple and important message that America will not tolerate violence against women, children, and families. We must do our part to reduce domestic violence and sexual assault. It's time for us to step up and make sure this happens now. I look forward to casting my vote for the reauthorization, hopefully very soon. And truly, this legislation, as we continue to move forward, is headed in the right direction. There is bipartisan support, with 61 of us in this chamber signed on as co-sponsors. And it's a lot of good work the bill has done through the Judiciary Committee. All of us have heard from prosecutors, victim service providers, judges, healthcare professionals, and victims themselves. Unfortunately, the fight to protect women and families from violence is far from over. The Violence Against Women's Act was first passed just 18 years ago and hasn't been reauthorized since 2006. The law has many differences. We are making progress, and we know a great deal more about domestic violence than when the VAWA was first written. Services for victims have improved. More communities offer safer shelters. Local, state, and federal laws are stronger. Listen to these national statistics. Since the law was first passed in 1994, the number of women killed by an intimate partner has dropped 30%. And annual rates of domestic violence against women have decreased by 2/3. VAWA really does save lives and works. Yet there are still far too many awful stories, inexcusable numbers, especially in my home state. Alaska continues to have some of the worst statistics in the country. 3 out of every 4 Alaskans have or known someone who has experienced domestic or sexual violence. Child sexual assault in Alaska is almost 6 times the national average. 1 out of every 100 adult women in Alaska, nearly 60, have experienced intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or both. The rape rate in Alaska is nearly 2.5 times the national average, and even worse for Alaskan Native women. In Alaska's rural and Native communities, domestic violence and sexual assault is far too common. Our numbers are often far worse than the rest of the country, and clearly we have to continue to do more work in this area. insisting that Alaska tribes retain their current authority to issue civil protective orders. And I'm working on a separate bill to expand resources for Alaska tribes in their fight against violence. So you can see why I'm standing here today. We need to do something about this. Not someday, not next year, but truly today. I've been around here for 3 years now, and I'm not shy about having my say in a good political fight. But in this case, on this issue, truly I have no patience. It's hard to believe we even have to debate the law that protects people from abuse and sexual violence. It's truly a piece of legislation we should just move forward and vote on. We need fewer victims, whoever they are, women, kids, white, black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, immigrants, lesbian and gay people, even men. As a former mayor in a city and a state with higher rate of abuse than the rest of the country, I know this issue. I was responsible for the municipal department that prosecuted domestic violence cases. I was also responsible for the police investigating these cases, and the agencies providing health services to victims and funding to shelters. With the support of the entire community, we pooled our efforts. Using resources from the state and local government and businesses and nonprofits alike, we improved services for victims of child sexual abuse. But intervention and better treatment is not enough. Far from it. Domestic and sexual violence is a public health epidemic. So what we really need is prevention. And this reauthorization effort is just that, the right step in eventually stopping this epidemic. In Alaska, Violence Against Women's Act dollars are used in our biggest cities, in our smallest villages. Funding goes to every corner of the state, the Yamonic Women's Shelter in remote southwest Alaska, to the Allied community of St. Paul Island in the North Pacific Ocean, to Aware Shelter in urban Juneau, and many others throughout Alaska. We asked the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault for their stories. Examples on how VAWA is helping real families. Here is just one. It's uncomfortable to hear, but it's exactly why we need to act now. A shelter in rural Alaska helped a young woman after she suffered a domestic assault by the father of their 3-year-old child. When she had asked the father for money for food, he choked her and threw her to the ground in front of the child. She reported this was the third such incident of violence, and she could not live there anymore. She spent time in a shelter recovering from her injuries and working to find safe housing in her home village. She also attended DV education groups and received a referral for legal services to assist her with her custody order. Months later, the shelter program received a call from this quiet young woman. She and her child were safe and doing well. She had read all the books recommended to her by the shelter to help her understand the cycle of domestic violence. She was looking for suggestions on more reading material to continue her education on the topic. Now it's hoped that the young woman will become a leader in her community so she can help educate others and work to end domestic violence in Alaska. Madam President, there are stories like this from all over the country, stories of assault and rape and murder. Need we hear more? It's time to reauthorize VAWA. Before I yield the floor, I have one more bit of business. I want to thank the shelter staff, the police, the court system employees, the advocates, and everyone else who works so hard to protect women, children, and families across this country. And to the victims of domestic violence, whoever you are, there is truly hope. We will work with you for you to break the cycle of violence and to bring an end and a change in this area. Thank you, and I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Violence Against Women Act that Senator Begich was talking about expires at the end of this year. In addition to our live coverage of the House and the Senate, the Senate Judiciary Committee is hearing testimony right now from Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano. This is her first congressional testimony since Secret Service agents were accused of hiring prostitutes in Cartagena, Colombia, ahead of a presidential trip there. The Secret Service is part of the Homeland Security Department. You can see that live right now at C-SPAN 3 and cspan.org. Majority Leader Harry Reid has said that he expects up to 9 roll call votes be necessary to finish action today on the post office bill. Then after that, the Senate is expected to move on to the domestic violence measure. The Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee meets today, and this afternoon at 2:15 Eastern, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke is holding a news conference to talk about the Fed's economic projections and policy decisions. You can see that live on C-SPAN 3.
Would ask the quorum call be eviscerated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about an issue that affects every American community. Although it's hard to imagine right now, some of the people we serve fear for their own lives, not because of a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. They're afraid that somebody who is supposed to love them or support them will hurt or even kill them. Madam President, this is an upsetting issue, but one that we need to face head-on, and I'm glad we're addressing it today. Domestic violence and sexual assault are harsh realities. They know no class, race, or economic limitations. Although we've made good progress curbing domestic and sexual violence over the past decade, we still have a lot of work to do. The legislation before us takes another step toward our goal of ending domestic and sexual violence. It might not go far enough for some, but, Madam President, it is progress, and I am proud to support it. Over the years, the Violence Against Women Act has helped reduce the rates of domestic and dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, but the numbers are still stunning. Madam President, this bill gives us an opportunity to help victims get out of a dangerous situation. We have an obligation to pass this reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Unfortunately, Montana is no different from the rest of the nation. There were almost 5,000 cases of domestic violence or sexual assault in 2011. 10% of them are on Montana kids. Federal funding is crucial for Montana's shelters, crisis lines, mental health services, and victim advocates. The domestic and sexual violence programs in Montana rely heavily on Violence Against Women Act funding to keep women and children safe and to administer the important programs that we have operating in Montana. It will also promote changes in the culture of law enforcement, pushing governments and courts to treat violence against women and children as a serious violation of criminal law and to hold the offenders accountable. The Violence Against Women Act helped a constituent of mine in Billings rebuild her life after she was the victim of domestic violence. Maria Martin was beaten by her boyfriend. He threatened to kill her and her 3 daughters. Her cries for help were answered by the police, who rescued Maria from a violent attack. But it is the program supported by the Violence Against Women Act that helped Maria rebuild her life. The Violence Against Women Act provides funding to strengthen law enforcement, prosecution, and victim services. Each community has flexibility to use these funds in ways that respond to folks most in need and take into account the unique cultural and geographical factors. This is especially important for a rural state like Montana. I am proud of my work with the Judiciary Committee to ensure that the set-aside of funding for sexual assault services does not disadvantage service providers in Montana, who often offer many services in one place. I want to thank Chairman Leahy for his efforts to address this important issue. For states and cities with specialized programs, this wasn't a big concern. In Montana and other rural states, we have county and regional service coalitions. That means funds must be flexible enough so that we can serve everyone who walks in. If rural areas had to carve out funds for each type of service, people wouldn't get what they need to regain their footing. The next closest facility might be 90 miles away. That's not a referral. It's not help. It is another obstacle for folks who are already facing a life-threatening situation. Domestic violence crimes also take a heavy toll on those who survive this violence. The vast majority of survivors report lingering effects such as post-traumatic stress disorder, serious injury directly from the abuse, missing school or work, higher frequencies of headaches, chronic pain, and poor physical and mental health. And while domestic violence affects every community, every race, and every rung of the economic ladder, the problem is even more severe in Montana's Indian country. In fact, violence against Native American women and children is at an epidemic level. As Montana's only member of the Senate's Indian Affairs Committee, I've had several hearings on domestic and sexual violence. American Indian women suffer from violent crime at a rate 3.5 times greater than the national average. Nearly 40% of all Native American women will experience domestic violence. 1 in 3 will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime. Murder is the 3rd leading cause of death among Indian women. In response to our hearing, I was proud to join Chairman Akaka and many others on the committee in introducing the Stand Against Violence and Empower Native Women, Save Native Women Act, which is now included in the bill before us today. We owe it to the women and children of Montana to intervene, to provide resources to the programs which are on the ground, and to providers who are in the trenches. They offer safe havens, support, and educational services to help survivors of sexual or domestic violence break free of the cycle of violence. They help children who have lived with violence understand and make sense of what has happened so that they are less likely to get entangled into future abusive relationships. They help survivors gain the strength and the know-how to advocate for themselves in the legal system and in their relationships. By passing this bill now, we will continue to make progress toward empowering communities to protect all citizens, particularly the most vulnerable, women and children. As I stated before, Madam President, this is not just an opportunity. This is an obligation that we have to improve our communities, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I want to thank you, Madam President. Yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The last 2 days we've been covering the British inquiry into phone hacking. The New York Times writes that speaking before an inquiry today, News Corporation chief Rupert Murdoch sought to deflect suggestions that he wielded influence with British officials to further his corporate interests. You can see Rupert Murdoch's testimony at cspan.org, and he'll be back before the committee again tomorrow morning, and we'll have it live starting at 5 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN 2.
Without objection.
And consent to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, next month students all over the United States will begin graduating from college. There's a lot of pride in that experience. Family and friends will gather and celebrate. These young graduates are going to be filled with hope, expectation, and gratitude to those who helped them reach this milestone in their lives. But they're also going to be graduating with debt. In some cases, massive amounts of debt. 96% of for-profit college students will graduate with a debt of $33,000. 15% of them, 1 out of 6, will default on their loans within 2 years. There's now more than $1 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. As I mentioned on the floor several times, a little over a year ago, for the first time in history, student loan debt in America surpassed credit card debt. One of the reasons there's been such a huge influx is that college costs continue to rise at unsustainable rates. Tuition fees at four-year schools have rocketed up 300% from 1990 through 2011. And over the same period, broad inflation was just 75%. Even health care costs rose at half the rate of the cost of higher education. The average for-profit college costs $30,900 a year in tuition and fees. Private, nonprofit institutions aren't too far behind. Average tuition and fees run about $26,600. Schools with larger endowments charge even more, upwards of $50,000 to $57,000 in total fees. They use their endowment to give students large financial aid packages, which is admirable, but it has consequences. The elevated sticker price for these schools provides for-profit colleges the cover to raise their prices to similar levels. And let me remind you, for-profit schools, for-profit colleges in America get more, up to and more than 90% of their revenue directly from the federal government. They are 10% away from being federal agencies. Students graduating this year have one advantage. If they took out federal subsidized loans, their interest rate is low. In 2007, Congress set interest rates on subsidized federal student loans for the last several years. Current graduates have low, affordable interest rates on their federal loans from 6.8% to 3.4%, depending on the year they took out the loan. Graduates next year may not be so lucky. The interest rate goes up to 6.8% for all unless Congress acts. That's because these rates, set to double for 740 million students across the country on 1st of July, will only be changed if Congress acts. That's going to affect 365,000 plus borrowers in my state of Illinois. Each borrower in Illinois will save $1,000 plus over the lifetime of their loan if current interest rates of 3.4% continue. Across the state, borrowers will save a total of $387,000. Every week in my office, we hear from students who would be directly affected by interest rate increases. One of them is George Jacobs, a constituent of mine and graduate of the International Academy of Design and Technology in Chicago, a for-profit college owned by the Career Education Corporation. Every day of his life, George Jacobs regrets that he ever attended this school. He's 29 years old. His current private student loan balance has ballooned to $107,000. The original loan was $60,000. But with a variable interest rate, George has been paying anywhere from 7 to 13.9%. Now you combine that with his federal loan balance, and his total outstanding student loan debt is $142,000. George isn't even 30 years old. He already has the debt the size of some people's mortgages on their homes. Unlike a lot of his peers who attend for-profit colleges, George has a job in his field of study. But his annual salary of $45,000, but since his lender won't let him consolidate the loan, his monthly payment on that annual salary is $1,364 a month. Half of his income goes to pay his loan. Unfortunately, because of high interest rates, very little of this payment reduces the principal. He doesn't know when he'll possibly pay off this loan. When asked if he's tried to work out a plan with his lender, he says they won't talk to him. They just don't care. George was the first in his immediate family to attend college. He didn't ask people for advice on financial matters. He trusted the school. George was subjected to high-pressure sales that some for-profit colleges use. Reflecting on that experience now, George feels like the school took advantage of him. He feels the school's primary focus is to identify people they can make money off of. George owes about $29,000 in federal loans. With low interest rates, his monthly payment is $230 a month on the federal loans. Amount, he said, is not a real problem. He's married, and although he and his wife own a car, he doesn't think they'll ever qualify for a mortgage. Madam President, he's 29 years old. George is not the only one affected by the private student loans. His parents are in their 50s. To help George, they co-signed his private student loan. They cannot refinance the mortgage on their home because of George's outstanding debt. There was a story in the Washington Post about 2 weeks ago of a woman, a grandmother, who now has her Social Security check garnished because she was kind enough to co-sign her granddaughter's college loan. Her granddaughter has defaulted. Her grandmother is watching her Social Security check reduced. Making college affordable shouldn't be partisan. It affects everybody. Just this week, during a news conference in Pennsylvania, Governor Mitt Romney acknowledged the tough job market new graduates face and expressed support for keeping interest rates low. He said, "I fully support the effort to extend low interest rates on student loans. Temporary relief on interest rates for students is a result of, in part, because of the extremely poor conditions in the job market." Higher education isn't a luxury anymore. It's part of the American dream that many of us bought into and invested in. An educated workforce will make us a stronger nation. By 2018, 63% of jobs will require post-secondary education. Keeping debt levels low and manageable for college graduates is essential. George Jacobs, like so many other students I've spoken about on this floor, are going to spend the rest of their young adult life paying for student loans. There's always been a lot of talk around here about mortgage crises, and rightly so. But think about 17 and 18 and 19-year-old students signing away their income for the next 30 years before they can even dream of a job or owning a home. We're going to consider legislation when we get back from the break in about 10 days on making sure that student loan interest rates are manageable. There's more to this issue. We have to deal with the reality that the President raised in the State of the Union address. This spiraling cost of higher education is unsustainable and unfair, fundamentally unfair. And you say to the young people, get educated for your future. And they follow our advice and walk into the student loan trap. Unfortunately, many for-profit schools are the worst offenders. These schools have an enrollment that's grown 225% over the past 10 years. According to the Chronicle of Higher Education, enrollment at for-profit colleges in my state has grown 556% over the last 10 years. They enrolled 1.2 million students in 2009. In the 2008-2009 academic year, the GAO found that for-profit colleges took in $24 billion in Title IV aid. Four-year for-profit schools cost an average of $27,900 a year before aid, as compared to $16,900 for public four-year universities. The chief executives at most of the for-profit schools, parents' company, make many times more than their counterparts in nonprofit schools. Remember, 90% plus of their revenue comes directly from the federal government. These aren't great entrepreneurs. These are folks who have managed to tap into one of the most generous federal subsidies in the law. And 5 years ago, we gave them a break. In the bankruptcy bill, we said private for-profit schools will be the only private loans in America that are not dischargeable in bankruptcy, which means you carry them to the grave. So the for-profit schools give these private loans, the students and their parents sign up for them, and when it's all said and done, they end up saddled with this impossible debt for a lifetime. That's not even to go to the question about whether or not they're receiving any kind of valuable education in the process. For-profits, incidentally, spent 21% plus of their expenses on instruction, 21% on instruction. It was 29.5% at public institutions, 32.7% at private nonprofit institutions. USA Today reported that for-profits educate fewer than 10% of students, take in 25% of all federal aid to education, and account for 44% of defaults among borrowers. Remember those numbers, 10, 25, and 44. They're taking in 10% of the students, taking in 25% of all the federal aid to education, and 44% of the defaults on student loans are attributable to these for-profit schools. According to the Project on Student Debt, 96% of for-profit college students graduate with some debt, compared to 72% of private nonprofit grads, 62% of public school grads. The Project on Student Debt also reported that borrowers who graduated from for-profit four-year programs have an average debt of $33,000 compared to $27,006 at private nonprofits, $20,000 at public schools. Last year, the Department of Education released a report showing that for-profit schools have a student loan default rate overall of 15%, compared with 7.2% at public schools, 4.6% at private nonprofit schools. Madam President, if I were to stand before you and talk about any other business in America heavily subsidized by the federal government, beyond 90% of all the revenues they take in, that is luring students and their families into unmanageable debt, I would hope that both sides of the aisle would stand up and say that is unacceptable. How can we subsidize an operation that is causing such hardship on students and their families, hardship that they're going to carry for a lifetime? George Jacobs, at age 29, writing off the possibility of ever owning a home because he signed up at one of these for-profit schools in my state. Madam President, the U.S. Senate Health Committee also discovered that out of $640 million in post-9/11 GI benefits, a bill we were all proud to vote for, out of the $640 million that flowed to for-profit schools in the last academic year, $439 million went to the largest 15 publicly traded companies. For-profit colleges are receiving $1 out of every $2 in military tuition assistance, according to the Department of Defense. And more than 60% of education benefits available to military spouses go to for-profit schools. This is significant. We capped federal aid to for-profit schools at 90% of their revenue, but we created an exception for the GI Bill. So some of them are up to 95% federal subsidy, and still we have these terrible results and terrible indebtedness. Students at for-profit colleges have lower success rates than similar students in public and nonprofit colleges, including graduation rates, employment outcomes, debt levels, and loan default rates. Yet, the Department of Defense is paying more to for-profit schools for the GI Bill than public and nonprofit institutions. Madam President, I want to enter into the record here, along with my remarks, an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, April 18th. It tells the story of Jody Ramin, who between the ages of 18 and 22 took out $74,000 in student loans. She attended Kent State University, a public university, in Ohio. It seemed like a good investment at the time, but now it's going to delay her career, her marriage, and her decision to have children. Ms. Ramin's $900 a month loan payments eat up 60% of the paycheck she earns as bank teller in South Carolina, the best job she could get after graduating from college. Her fiancé spends 40% of his paycheck on student loans. They each work more than 60 hours a week and volunteer where they can to help with local high school and basketball teams, football and basketball teams. Ms. Ramin works a second job as a waitress, making all her loan payments on time. She can't buy a house. They can't visit their families in Ohio as often as they would like or spend money to even go out. Plans to marry or have children are on hold, says Ms. Ramin. I'm just looking for some way to manage my finances. This is an indication of a debt crisis that is coming. It's different, I would agree, than the mortgage debt crisis that we faced. Smaller in magnitude, perhaps, but no less insidious and no less of a problem for us when it comes to the growth of our economy. Madam President, I have a couple bills pending. One of them goes to a very basic question. Should any college, public, private, profit, nonprofit, be allowed to lure a student into a private student loan when they are still eligible for government loans? In other words, shouldn't that be one of the causes for a discharge in bankruptcy? It's fraud. It's fraud to say to that student, you have to take out this private student loan, even though the school knows that student is still eligible for low interest rates accommodating federal loans. They're luring them into a debt that is unnecessary and a debt which is crushing in some circumstances. Now, at the very minimum, that should be considered fraud in a bankruptcy court. and that debt should be dischargeable in bankruptcy because of the failure of the school to disclose that the student still has eligibility for a federal loan. Secondly, I know that I'm probably crying in the wilderness here, but I still find it inconceivable that the only private sector business loan in America that is not dischargeable in bankruptcy goes to these heavily subsidized for-profit schools. First, we lord them with federal money, 90% plus, and then we turn around and say, and we'll protect you when the student who is likely to default ends up defaulting. We'll make sure that they still have the debt, carrying it to the grave. What were we thinking? To give this one business this kind of fantastic federal subsidy and this kind of amazing support in the bankruptcy code. I will tell you, I ask consent to enter into the record, along with that article from the Wall Street Journal, a recent article from Barron's, thank you, Madam President, of April the 16th. So they identified those who were offering these private student loans. The major players in the private non-government-backed student loan market, SLM, let me translate, formerly known as Sallie Mae, Discover Financial Services, Wells Fargo, and PNC Financial Services. Even with the defaults, if there are defaults on these loans are protected because they continue forever. Madam President, I don't know if my colleagues will join me in this, but all I ask them to do is go home and please talk to some of the families in your state. And you will find out that this student loan crisis is not just something manufactured by politicians. It is real. And we are complicit in it. When we allow low-performing and worthless schools to receive federal aid to education, students and their families are lured into believing these are real schools. Go to the Internet and put in the word college or university, click the mouse, and watch what happens. You will be inundated with ads from for-profit schools. Some of them will tell you can go to school online. One of them ran a television ad here in Washington, I think they've taken it off the air now, that showed this lovely young girl who was in her bedroom, in her pajamas, with her computer or laptop on the bed. And the purpose of the ad was, you can graduate from college at home in your pajamas. It's a ruse, it's a farce, it's a fraud. Many times these schools offer nothing but debt for these students. And the students who drop out, the worst of circumstances. They don't even get the worthless diploma from the for-profit school. All they get is the debt. That's not fair. If we have a responsibility, and I think we do, to families across America, for goodness sakes, on a bipartisan basis, we should step up and deal with the student debt crisis and the for-profit schools who are exploiting it. Madam President, I yield the floor. Excuse me, Madam President. If the Senator from Tennessee will allow me, I have 11 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate with the approval of majority and minority leaders, and ask consent these requests be agreed to and printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam President. Asked to speak for up to 15 minutes in morning business.
Without objection.
And could the chair please let me know when there are 2 minutes left?
Yes.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. I'm glad I had a chance to hear my distinguished friend from Illinois speak about student loans and college. All of us would like to make it easier for Americans to be able to afford college, and at another time I'll speak about some of the other options available. The average tuition at four-year colleges in America is $8,000. The average tuition for four-year public colleges is $8,200. The average tuition for community colleges, two-year colleges, is $3,000. I know at the University of Tennessee, where tuition is about $8,000, a very good campus in Knoxville, virtually all the freshmen show up with a $4,000 Hope Scholarship, a state scholarship, and of course, if they're lower-income students, they're eligible for Pell Grants and other aid. So we'll continue to work on a bipartisan basis to make this opportunity available to students, and if there are abuses in the for-profit sector or other sectors of higher education, we should work on those together. But I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically this morning about the issue of student loans and interest rates on student loans. President Obama is busy this week on campuses across America talking about student loans. It's a noble goal to talk about making it easier for students to afford college. It's a goal we all share, but I'm afraid the President's not telling the whole story, because if he were to tell the whole story, what he would have to tell the students is that the principal reason for the rise in tuition at public colleges and universities across America and community colleges, and the principal reason for the increase in student loans is President Obama himself and his own health care policies.
Would the Senator yield for a unanimous consent request?
Of course.
And I don't want to change your line of thought here.
No.
It's beautiful, and I want to hear every word.
No.
I ask unanimous consent that after the conclusion of the remarks of the Senator from Tennessee, that there will be 10 minutes given to the Senator from Wyoming, Senator Barrasso, and that I have the remainder of the Republican time.
Without objection.
Is there any Democrats that they go 11:30 at that time?
Yeah.
Without objection.
Sure, of course. But so, as I was saying, President Obama's speeches around the country on college campuses about student debt are incomplete, because the rest of the story, unfortunately, is that the main reason why college tuition is going up, and the main reason, therefore, why loans are going up, is President Obama and his health care policies. Now, to be fair, he didn't start many of these policies. They've been going on for a good while. But he's made them worse over the last 3 or 4 years, and when the new health care law goes into effect in 2014 with its new mandates on states, we'll find an exaggeration of what's already been happening, which is that federal health care mandates on states are soaking up the money that states otherwise would spend on the University of Oklahoma and Tennessee and the State University of New York. And when states don't support their public colleges and universities, which is where 3/4 of our higher education students attend, then their only choice is either to become more efficient, to decrease their quality, or to raise tuition. And most of them are trying to do all three. So federal health care policies are the reason tuition is up, and the reason tuition is up is the main reason. The main reason debt is up. Now, specifically what we're talking about, or what the President's been talking about, is a 3.4% interest rate for some student loans. Here's some facts about that. The President has proposed that for 1 year for new loans, rates would remain at 3.4% for this kind of loan. Governor Romney agrees with him. I agree with him. So there's substantial support from both the President and his probable Republican opponent in the presidential race for this next year, new loans after July 1, that now are at 3.4%, would stay at 3.4%. The benefit to students who get the advantage of that lower rate, all other loans are at 6.8% by law, is about $7 a month. That's according to the Congressional Research Service. So all this talk is about offering students the benefit of about $7 a month for new loans. It's important to notice that no student who has a 3.4% loan today will see his or her interest rate go up. Let me say that again. If you've got a loan and you're going to the University of North Carolina and you're paying 3.4% today, your rate will not go up on July 1. The law only affects new loans. And it doesn't affect 60% of loans. For 60% of those who are getting new loans after July 1, they'll continue to pay the 6.8% rate set by Congress a long time ago. But, Madam President, I'm glad the President's bringing this issue up, because the real driver of higher tuition and higher interest rates are the President's own policies, in two ways. The government and the congressional Democrats who passed the health care law actually are overcharging students, all students, on their student loans, and using some of the money to pay for the health care law. Now, this isn't just my figures. The Congressional Budget Office said that when the new health care law passed, Congress took $61 billion of so-called savings, I'd call them profits, on student loans, and it spent $10 billion to reduce the debt, $8.7 billion on the health care law, and the rest on Pell Grants. Now, how does that work? How could Congress be overcharging students? Well, under the law, the government borrows money at 2.8%. Under the law, the government loans to students at 6.8%. That produces a profit. The Congressional Budget Office has said that the Congress could lower the interest rate from 6.8 to 5.3% and save all students $2,200 over the life of their average 10-year loan. So I'm introducing today legislation on my behalf and that of others called the Student Interest Rate Reduction Act. And what we will propose with this law is that we will keep the interest rate at 3.4% for subsidized Stafford loans beginning with the year July 1, just as President Obama has proposed, just as Governor Romney has proposed, and we will pay for that by taking back from the health care law money that the Congress overcharged students on their student loans. This one-year solution, as I said, will save students about $7 a month on interest payments on their new loans, about $83 a year. It will cost the taxpayers about $6 billion, which will be paid for by reductions in savings from the Health Care Act. Now let's talk just a moment, Madam President, about the real cause of tuition going up and loans going up. And that is federal health care policy. When I was governor of Tennessee in the 1980s, the same thing would happen every year as I made up my state budget, and it's happening today in every state capital in America. I'd work through all the things that we had to fund with state tax dollars, the roads, the schools, the prisons, the various state agencies. And then I'd get down to the end of the budgeting process and I had some money left. And the choice would always be between Medicaid and higher education, our public colleges and universities. I spent my whole 8 years trying to keep the amount that we gave to Medicaid down so I could get up the amount for colleges and universities because I thought that was the future of our state. In fact, we had a formula back then that said that if you went to a public college or university, the taxpayer would pay for 70% of it and the student would pay for 30%. And if we raised your tuition, we'd raise the state's share. So we kept that 70-30. Madam President, that's turned completely around today in Tennessee. It's now 30-70. The students pay 70% and the taxpayers pay 30%. And why is that? It's because for that 30 years, orders from Washington about Medicaid mandates to every state have forced governors and legislatures to take the money they would otherwise spend for colleges, public colleges and universities, and spend it instead for Medicaid. And as a result, the state colleges and universities have less money, and to get more money, they raise tuition. So when tuition goes up at the University of California and you see students protesting, the reason is in Washington. The reason is in Washington. Now, I said earlier, President Obama did not invent this problem. This is a 30-year problem, but he's made it worse. He made it worse with the laws that said when states have less money, they have to spend more on Medicaid. Well, if they are told from Washington to spend more on Medicaid, even though they have less revenues, they're going to spend less on something else. So they spend less on the University of California or the State University of New York or the University of Tennessee. Last year in Tennessee, state funding for Medicaid went up 15% in actual dollars. As a result, state funding for the community colleges and the University of Tennessee went down 15%. Real cuts. That's not a cut in growth, that's real cuts. And what did the colleges and universities do? They raised tuition 8%. And what do students do? They borrow more money. Now, I've been trying to get this point across ever since I've been a United States Senator. I even said during the health care debate that everyone who voted for it ought to be sentenced to go serve as governor for 8 years in his or her home state so they'd understand this problem. We can't continue to order the states to spend more for Medicaid and expect our great colleges and universities to be affordable and to continue to be the best in the world. That is the real reason why tuition is going up and loans are going up. So here are the facts. There's still good options for students around the country. I mentioned a little earlier the average cost of a 4-year public university in America is for tuition $8,200, and for a community college is $3,000. There are many scholarships to help go there. And it is true that loans are going up to very high levels. And it is true that there are some abuses here or there in the for-profit industry or in other parts of the higher education system. But it is also true that in the United States we not only have some of the best colleges and universities in the world, we have almost all of them. And many of them are public colleges and universities, and they are at risk today. Why? Because of federal health care policies that are hamstringing states and soaking up the money that states should be using to fund the universities of this country and the community colleges of this country. So, Mr. President, I'm introducing today the Student Loan Interest Rate Reduction Act. It addresses exactly the subject that President Obama is talking about on the campaign trail these days. How do we keep the interest rate on subsidized Stafford loans, the new loans that began July 1, how do we keep that at 3.4% for 1 year? Governor Romney supports that. President Obama supports that. I support that. The only difference is how we pay for it. It's a $6 billion cost. Our friends on the Democratic side have come up with their usual method of paying for it. They're going to put a tax on people who create jobs. We have a little better idea on this side, and that is, let's take back $6 billion of the dollars that the federal government overcharges students on student loans today to help pay for the health care law, and let's give it back to the students, and let's extend this for 1 year. That'll leave about $2 or $3 billion extra, and we can use that to shore up. Thank you, Madam President. We can use that to shore up the Pell Grant deficit that's expected over the next couple of years.